The Halifax Explosion was a maritime disaster in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, on the morning of 6 December 1917. SS Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship laden with high explosives, collided with the Norwegian vessel SS Imo in the Narrows, a strait connecting the upper Halifax harbour to Bedford Basin. A fire on board the French ship ignited her cargo, causing a large explosion that devastated the Richmond district of Halifax. Approximately 2,000 people were killed by debris, fires and collapsed buildings, and an estimated 9,000 others were injured. Mont Blanc was under orders from the French government to carry her cargo of high explosives from New York via Halifax to Bordeaux, France. At roughly 8:45 a.m., she collided at low speed with the unladen Imo, chartered by the Commission for Relief in Belgium to pick up a cargo of relief supplies in New York. The resulting fire aboard the French ship quickly grew out of control. Approximately 20 minutes later at 9:04:35 am, Mont Blanc exploded. The blast was the largest man-made explosion prior to the development of nuclear weapons, releasing the equivalent energy of roughly 2.9 kilotons of TNT. Nearly all structures within an 800-meter radius, including the entire community of Richmond, were obliterated. A pressure wave snapped trees, bent iron rails, demolished buildings, grounded vessels, and scattered fragments of the Mont Blanc for kilometers. Hardly a window in the city proper survived the blast. Across the harbour, in Dartmouth, there was also widespread damage. A tsunami created by the blast wiped out the community of Mi'kmaq First Nations people who had lived in the Tufts Cove area for generations. Relief efforts began almost immediately, and hospitals quickly became full. Rescue trains began arriving from across eastern Canada and the northeastern United States, but were impeded by a blizzard. Construction of temporary shelters to house the many people left homeless began soon after the disaster. The initial judicial inquiry found the Mont Blanc to have been responsible for the disaster, but a later appeal determined that both vessels were to blame. There are several memorials to the victims of the explosion in North End. Background: the community of Dartmouth lies on the east shore of Halifax Harbour, while Halifax is on the west shore. Halifax and Dartmouth thrived during times of war. The harbour was one of the British Royal Navy's most important bases in North America, a centre for wartime trade, and a home to privateers who harried the British Empire's enemies during the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. The completion of the Intercolonial Railway and its deep-water terminal in 1880 allowed for increased steamship trade and led to accelerated development of the port area. But Halifax faced an economic downturn after the British garrison left the city in late 1905 and early 1906. After 1906, the Canadian government took over the Halifax dockyard from the Royal Navy. This dockyard later became the command centre of the Royal Canadian Navy upon its founding in 1910. Just before the First World War, the Canadian government began to make a determined, costly effort to develop the harbour and waterfront facilities. The outbreak of the war brought Halifax back to prominence, as the Royal Canadian Navy had virtually no seaworthy ships of its own. The Royal Navy assumed responsibility for maintaining Atlantic trade routes by readopting Halifax as its North American base of operations. In 1915, management of the harbour fell under the control of the Royal Canadian Navy under the supervision of Captain Superintendent Edward Harrington Martin. By 1917 there was a growing naval fleet in Halifax, including patrol ships, tugboats, and minesweepers. The population of Halifax, Dartmouth had increased to between 60,000 and 65,000 people by 1917. Convoys carried soldiers, men, animals and supplies to the European theatre of war. The two main points of departure were in Nova Scotia at Sydney and Cape Breton and Halifax. Hospital ships brought the wounded to the city, and a new military hospital was constructed in the city. The success of German U-boat attacks on ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean led the Allies to institute a convoy system to reduce losses while transporting goods and soldiers to Europe. Merchant ships gathered at Bedford Basin on the northwestern end of the harbour, which was protected by two sets of anti-submarine nets and guarded by patrol ships of the Royal Canadian Navy. The convoys departed under the protection of British cruisers and destroyers. A large army garrison protected the city with forts, gun batteries, and anti-submarine nets. These factors drove a major military, industrial and residential expansion of the city, while the weight of goods passing through the harbour increased nearly ninefold. All neutral ships, bound for ports in North America, were required to report to Halifax for inspection. Disaster. The Norwegian ship, SS Imo, had sailed from the Netherlands en route to New York to take on relief supplies for Belgium, under the command of Harken from. The ship arrived in Halifax on the 3rd of December for neutral inspection and spent 2 days in Bedford Basin awaiting refueling supplies. Though given clearance to leave the port on the 5th of December, Imo's departure was delayed as her coal load did not arrive until late that afternoon. The loading of fuel was not completed until after the anti-submarine nets had been raised for the night. Therefore, the vessel could not weigh anchor until the next morning. The French cargo ship SS Mont Blanc arrived from New York late on the 5th of December, under the command of Amy Akutla-Madec. The vessel was fully loaded with the explosives TNT and picric acid, the high-octane fuel benzol, and gun cotton. She intended to join a slow convoy gathering in Bedford Basin readying to depart for Europe, but was too late to enter the harbour before the nets were raised. Ships carrying dangerous cargo were not allowed into the harbour before the war, but the risks posed by German submarines had resulted in a relaxation of regulations. Navigating into or out of Bedford Basin required passage through a strait called the Narrows. Ships were expected to keep to the starboard side of the channel as they passed oncoming traffic. In other words, vessels were required to pass port to port. Ships were restricted to a speed of 5 knots within the harbour. Collision and fire. Imo was granted clearance to leave Bedford Basin by signals from the guard ship HMCS Acadia at approximately 7:30 on the morning of the 6th of December, with pilot William Hayes aboard. The ship entered the Narrows well above the harbour's speed limit in an attempt to make up for the delay experienced in loading her cargo. Imo met an American tramp steamer, SS Clara, being piloted up the wrong side of the harbour. The pilots agreed to pass starboard to starboard. Soon afterwards, though, Imo was forced to head even further towards the Dartmouth shore after passing the tugboat Stella Maris, which was traveling up the harbour to Bedford Basin near mid-channel. Horatio Brannan, the captain of Stella Maris, saw Imo approaching at excessive speed and ordered his ship closer to the western shore to avoid an accident. Francis Mackey, an experienced harbour pilot, had boarded the Mont Blanc on the evening of the 5th of December. He had asked about special protections, such as a guard ship given the Mont Blanc's cargo, but no protections were put in place. The Mont Blanc started moving at 7:30 a.m. on the 6th of December, heading towards Bedford Basin. Mackey kept his eye on the ferry traffic between Halifax and Dartmouth and other small boats in the area. He first spotted Imo when she was about 0.75 miles away and became concerned as her path appeared to be heading towards his ship's starboard side, as if to cut him off his own course. Mackey gave a short blast of his ship's signal whistle to indicate that he had the right of way, but was met with 2 short blasts from the Imo, indicating that the approaching vessel would not yield its position. The captain ordered Mont Blanc to halt its engines and angle slightly to starboard, closer to the Dartmouth side of the Narrows. He let out another single blast of his whistle, hoping the other vessel would likewise move to starboard, but was again met with a double blast in negation. Sailors on nearby ships heard the series of signals and, realizing that a collision was imminent, gathered to watch as Imo bore down on Mont Blanc. Though both ships had cut their engines by this point, their momentum carried them right on top of each other at slow speed. Unable to ground his ship for fear of a shock that would set off his explosive cargo, Mackey ordered Mont Blanc to steer hard to port and cross the Norwegian ship's bows in a last-second bid to avoid a collision. The two ships were almost parallel to each other when IMO suddenly sent out 3 signal blasts, indicating the ship was reversing its engines. The combination of the cargoless ship's height in the water and the transverse thrust of her right-hand propeller caused the ship's head to swing into Mont Blanc. IMO's prow pushed into the French vessel's No.1 hold on her starboard side. The collision occurred at 8:45 a.m. As IMO's engines kicked in, she quickly disengaged, which created sparks inside Mont Blanc's hull. These ignited the vapors from the benzol. A fire started at the waterline and traveled quickly up the side of the ship as the benzol spewed out from crushed drums on Mont Blanc's decks. The fire quickly became uncontrollable. Surrounded by thick black smoke, and fearing she would explode almost immediately, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. A growing number of Halifax citizens gathered on the street or stood at the windows of their homes or businesses to watch the spectacular fire. The frantic crew of Mont Blanc shouted from their 2 lifeboats to some of the other vessels that their ship was about to explode, but they could not be heard above the noise and confusion. As the lifeboats made their way across the harbor to the Dartmouth shore, the abandoned ship continued to drift and beached herself at Pier 6 near the foot of Richmond Street. The tug's captain, Horatio H. They were approached by a whaler from HMS Highflyer and later a steam pinnace belonging to HMCS Niobe. Captain Brannan and Albert Mattison of Niobe agreed to secure a line to the French ship's stern so as to pull it away from the pier to avoid setting it on fire. The 5-inch hawser initially produced was deemed too small and orders for a 10-inch hawser came down. It was at this point that the blast occurred. Explosion at 9:04:35 am. The out-of-control fire aboard Mont Blanc finally set off her highly explosive cargo. The ship was completely blown apart and a powerful blast wave radiated away from the explosion at more than 1,000 meters per second. Temperatures of 5,000 degrees Celsius and pressures of thousands of atmospheres accompanied the moment of detonation at the center of the explosion. White-hot shards of iron fell down upon Halifax and Dartmouth. Mont Blanc's forward 90mm guns, its barrel melted away, landed approximately 5.6 kilometers north of the explosion site near Albro Lake in Dartmouth, while the shank of her anchor, weighing half a ton, landed 3.2 kilometers south at Armdale. A cloud of white smoke rose to over 3,600 meters. The shock wave from the blast traveled through the Earth at nearly 23 times the speed of sound and was felt as far away as Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island. An area of over 160 hectares was completely destroyed by the explosion, while the harbor floor was momentarily exposed by the volume of water that vaporized. A tsunami was formed by water surging in to fill the void. It rose as high as 18 meters above the high water mark on the Halifax side of the harbor. IMO was carried onto the shore at Dartmouth by the tsunami. The blast killed all save one aboard the whaler. Everyone aboard the pinnace and 21 of the 26 men aboard Stella Maris. She ended up on the Dartmouth shore, severely damaged. The captain's son, first mate Walter Brannan, who had been thrown into the hold by the blast, survived, as did 4 others. All but one of the Mont Blanc crew members survived. Over 1,600 people were killed instantly and 9,000 were injured, more than 300 of whom later died. Every building within a 2.6-kilometre radius, over 12,000 in total, was destroyed or badly damaged. Hundreds of people who had been watching the fire from their homes were blinded when the blast wave shattered the windows in front of them. Stoves and lamps overturned by the force of the blast sparked fires throughout Halifax, particularly in the North End. where entire city blocks were caught up in the inferno, trapping residents inside their houses. Firefighter Billy Wells, who was thrown away from the explosion and had his clothes torn from his body, described the devastation survivors faced. The sight was awful, with people hanging out of windows dead, some with their heads missing, and some thrown onto the overhead telegraph wires. He was the only member of the 8-man crew of the fire engine, Patricia, to survive. Large brick and stone factories near Pier 6, such as the Acadia Sugar Refinery, disappeared into unrecognizable heaps of rubble, killing most of their workers. The Nova Scotia cotton mill, located 1.5 kilometers from the blast, was destroyed by fire and the collapse of its concrete floors. The Royal Naval College of Canada building was badly damaged, and several cadets and instructors maimed. The death toll could have been worse had it not been for the self-sacrifice of an intercolonial railway dispatcher, Patrick Vincent Coleman, operating at the rail yard about 750 feet from Pier 6, where the explosion occurred. He and his co-worker, William Lovett, learned of the dangerous cargo aboard the burning Mont Blanc from a sailor and began to flee. Coleman remembered, however, that an incoming passenger train from St. John, New Brunswick, was due to arrive at the rail yard within minutes. He returned to his post alone and continued to send out urgent telegraph messages to stop the train. Several variations of the message have been reported, among them this from the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. Hold up to the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Coleman's message may well have been responsible for bringing all incoming trains around Halifax to a halt. It was heard by other stations all along the Intercolonial Railway, helping railway officials to respond immediately. Passenger train No. 10, the overnight train from St. John, is believed to have heeded the warning and stopped a safe distance from the blast at Rockingham, saving the lives of about 300 railway passengers. Coleman was killed at his post as the explosion ripped through the city. He was honored with a Heritage Minute in the 1990s and inducted into the Canadian Railway Hall of Fame in 2004.